The last thing we heard of Mr. Frederick Douglass was him being broken, defeated, and realizing himself to be in the hottest hell of slavery. And the story doesn't stop there. Oh no. Covey the Negro breaker had more in store for him, because apparently he was vicious enough to work a person down to their very last breath, which he attempted to do to Mr. Frederick Douglass. In his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, he tells how little compassion Covey had for him when he nearly died from exhaustion on the plantation. This event occurred in the year 1834, where he says, "On one of the hottest days of the month of August of the year just mentioned, had the reader been passing through Covey's farm, he might have seen me at work in what is there called the treading yard, a yard upon which wheat is trodden out from the straw by the horses' feet. I was there, at work, feeding the fan, or rather bringing wheat to the fan, while Bill Smith was feeding. Our force consisted of Bill Hughes, Bill Smith, and a slave by the name of Eli, the latter having been hired for this occasion. The work was simple and required strength and activity, rather than any skill or intelligence, and yet, to one entirely unused to such work, it came very hard." And who was the person not used to such work? It was Mr. Douglass. This was his first time being an actual field hand. When he lived in Baltimore, he was more so a house servant for Mrs. Auld, and he did little errands for her. But until this point, he had never tasted the true field, and that's why this simple work came very hard to him. The heat was intense and overpowering, and there was much hurry to get the wheat trodden out that day through the fan. They used the airflow from the fan to separate the wheat from the chaff. The lighter chaff was blown away, leaving behind the heavier wheat grains. So they were in much hurry to get this done, since if that work was done an hour before sundown, the hands would have, according to a promise of Covey, that hour added to their night's rest. That was their incentive. You get this done an hour early and you can add an hour to your sleep. And oh man, that must have sounded like heaven to any Negroes under the supervision of Covey. So they were all motivated. That's why he says, "I was not behind any of them in the wish to complete the day's work before sundown, and hence I struggled with all my might to get the work forward, with every ounce of strength to meet that goal and to get that extra hour." And just as he was hustling and putting out all his effort, this happened. About 3 o'clock, while the sun was pouring down his burning rays, and not a breeze was stirring, I broke down. My strength failed me. I was seized with a violent aching of the head, attended with extreme dizziness and trembling in every limb. Finding what was coming, and feeling it would never do to stop work, I nerved myself up and staggered on until I fell by the side of the wheat fan, feeling that the earth had fallen upon me. This brought the entire work to a dead stand. Not now. I know that's what the slaves were thinking. You could have dropped down at any other time, but not now, because now the entire work was at a dead stand. They all depended on each other's work effort to complete the task. So when one stopped, they all stopped. And Douglass stopped. But it's not as if he was malingering or just faking the funk. He was really jacked up. So what happened was the other slave, Bill Smith, went to go and tell Covey that Douglass was sick and was unable to bring the wheat to the fan. During this time, Douglass had crawled over to the shade, and in this condition, Covey, finding out where I was, came to me, and after standing over me a while, he asked me what the matter was. I told him as well as I could, for it was with difficulty that I could speak. And after telling him this, did Covey go and get some ice water or some medical attention for him? Or did he do something else? Let's find out. He then gave me a savage kick in the side, which jarred my whole frame and commanded me to get up. They called him the Negro breaker for a reason. He could care less if a Negro was weak and half dead and about to die. There was work that needed to be done, so he kicked him and commanded him to get up. The man had obtained complete control over me, and if he had commanded me to do any possible thing, I should, in my then state of mind, have endeavored to comply. I made an effort to rise, but fell back in the attempt before gaining my feet. Now at this point, Covey for sure sees that he's really injured and he's having problems. He must have given him a little break or some time to recuperate, right? Let's see. The brute now gave me another heavy kick and again told me to rise. Vicious.
I again tried to rise and succeeded in gaining my feet, but upon stooping to get the tub with which I was feeding the fan, I again staggered and fell to the ground, and I must have so fallen, had I been sure that 100 bullets would have pierced me, as the consequence.
Here we go.
While down in this sad condition and perfectly helpless, the merciless Negro breaker took up the hickory slab, with which Hughes had been striking off the wheat to a level with the sides of the half-bushel measure, a very hard weapon, and with the sharp edge of it, he dealt me a heavy blow on my head which made a large gash, and caused the blood to run freely, saying at the same time,
"If you have got the headache, I'll cure you."
Uh-oh, it seems like the more injured a person is, the more vicious the Negro breaker becomes. It's like he lives for these moments, and that's why masters send their unmanageable slaves to him for training. He kicks and cracks people upside the head with the hard hickory stick, which causes gashes and the blood to run freely.
This done, he ordered me again to rise, but I made no effort to do so, for I had made up my mind that it was useless, and that the heartless monster might now do his worst. He could but kill me, and that might put me out of my misery.
He simply gave up. His face oozed with blood, his head was throbbing, so whatever Covey was going to do to him was just what was going to happen. Now, at this point, Covey left him alone to his fate, and he decided to continue the work without him. And after a short period of rest, Mr. Douglass mustered up some energy, and he got on his feet, and then he took off running towards his master Thomas Auld's house. He says,
I succeeded in getting nearly halfway across the broad field toward the woods, before Mr. Covey observed me. I was still bleeding, and the exertion of running had started the blood afresh.
"Come back! Come back!"
vociferated Covey, with threats of what he would do if I did not return instantly. But, disregarding his calls and his threats, I pressed on toward the woods as fast as my feeble state would allow.
This was life or death. It was full-on survival mode. And although terrified of Covey, being in the woods,
I was not without the fear of bleeding to death. After lying there about 3/4 of an hour, brooding over the singular and mournful lot to which I was doomed, my mind passing over the whole scale or circle of belief and unbelief, from faith in the overruling providence of God to the blackest atheism, I again took up my journey toward St. Michael's, more weary and sad than in the morning when I left Thomas Auld's for the home of Mr. Covey.
All types of thoughts going through his mind. Thoughts ranging from faith in God to the blackest atheism. Think about that word blackest in this context and what it symbolizes. Now, after this internal struggle, he gets up and he makes his way back to the house of Thomas Auld's, which was about 7 miles away. He looks like a complete mess at this point. He's got blood all over him. He's got bruises. He's got a gash in his head. And he hoped that Thomas would be considerate by seeing him in this situation and looking like this. So as he finally arrived at Thomas's house, he told him exactly what happened.
At first, Master Thomas seemed somewhat affected by the story of my wrongs, but he soon repressed his feelings and became cold as iron,
which was a frequent response in the profession of owning people.
It was impossible, as I stood before him at the first, for him to seem indifferent. I distinctly saw his human nature asserting its conviction against the slave system, which made cases like mine possible. But, as I have said, humanity fell before the systematic tyranny of slavery. He first walked the floor, apparently much agitated by my story, and the sad spectacle I presented. But presently it was his turn to talk.
And what did he say?
He began moderately by finding excuses for Covey, and ending with a full justification of him and a passionate condemnation of me.
He took the side of Covey. Understand that the whites set up a system where the testimony of those they called blacks, Negroes, and N-words were to never be upheld over any white person. They were to side with the whites at all cost. These were the societal norms in the South. So even though Thomas probably realized that there was some truth in what Mr. Douglass said, he had to suppress it and create justifications to side with Covey. So in his mind,
he had no doubt I deserved the flogging. He did not believe I was sick. I was only endeavoring to get rid of work. My dizziness was laziness, and Covey did right to flog me as he had done.
You see that? And why couldn't Douglass just call the police like anyone in America could do in this situation today? because the police and the government were in complete cahoots with the slave system. It would have been futile and a complete waste of time, since those they called blacks had no protection under the human-made societal law. So his best chance was to try to gain some favor in the eyes of his master. But that was also futile for him. After Thomas sided with Covey, which he figured that he would do, he couldn't defend himself any further, and that's why he says,
I must not affirm my innocence of the allegations which he had piled up against me, for that would be impudence and would probably call down fresh violence as well as wrath upon me.
So he held his tongue, and as Thomas calmed down a little bit, Thomas asked him what he expected him to do. Mr. Douglass told him to find him a new home and a new master, because he believed Covey the Negro breaker was surely going to kill him after he found out that he went back and told on him. And what happened was,
this, Master Thomas, my brother in the church, regarded as nonsense.
Uh-oh.
There was no danger of Mr. Covey's killing me. He was a good man, industrious and religious, and he would not think of removing me from that home. Besides, said he, and this I found was the most distressing thought of all to him,
if you should leave Covey now, that your year has but half expired, I should lose your wages for the entire year.
Money was more important than his life.
You belong to Mr. Covey for 1 year, and you must go back to him, come what will. You must not trouble me with any more stories about Mr. Covey, and if you do not go immediately home, I will get hold of you myself.
You hear that?
This was just what I expected, when I found he had prejudged the case against me. But, sir, I said, I am sick and tired, and I cannot get home tonight. At this he again relented, and finally he allowed me to remain all night at St. Michael's, but said I must be off early in the morning, and concluded his directions by making me swallow a huge dose of Epsom salts, about the only medicine ever administered to slaves.
So he allowed him to stay for just that night, but in the morning he had to get back up and go back to the Negro breaker. And we know this must have been a sleepless night for him, because who would want to return to this type of situation? Nobody, right? Nobody in their right mind, at least. But he was left with little choice, right? And we'll continue. I thank you right now for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.